Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. In today's show, I speak to Bobby Collins of Medicus, the Medicus Firm, which is a physician recruitment firm. And we talk about the physician job market, the value that a physician recruiter brings to the job hunt process. I don't think you absolutely have to have a recruiter, and many jobs are not advertised on websites or through job posts. Many of the best jobs don't only recruit by word of mouth. So definitely use your connections to look for a job. But if you are looking in an area of the country that you're not familiar with, a physician recruiter may be beneficial in the way that a real estate agent would be beneficial when you're purchasing a house, or a financial planner would be in regards to your overall financial picture. You can get there without their help, but sometimes their expertise may help you ask some questions that you wouldn't have thought of. So listen to this episode and listen to what Bobby talks about, what some of the value that physician recruiters bring to your job search. Welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. My guest today is Bob Collins, a managing partner at the Medicus Firm, a national physician recruitment firm. Bob founded Medicus Partners in 2001 and has been a guest speaker at many U.S. medical schools and residencies. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be on.
Tell our listeners about your background and how you got into this field.
Well, I got into the field by dumb luck. A good friend of mine went to work for a company and recruited me to come work to him. When I started, I didn't even know there was such a thing as physician recruiters, and roughly 26 years later, I'm still doing it. So I was very fortunate to find something I really enjoyed at a relatively young age.
The main question, I think, at a lot of people looking for jobs, especially coming out of residency, are why should a physician or other healthcare professional use a recruiter over just, searching the job boards or their own contacts?
Well, they're actually all really good sources, to be fair. I think it really depends what their priorities are. The majority of people find jobs through their own contacts and through people they trained with, or they stay where they trained because that's a predictable and somewhat safe environment. Where recruiters really add value is for those that are more open to the type of job, open to the location, and they're more focused on, here's what's important to me, and I need assistance in finding those opportunities there literally are thousands of jobs available depending on your specialty, of course. Right. So how do I really sift through those, and how do I find one that matches what I'm looking for, both professionally and personally? When we speak to doctors, one of the standard questions we're going to ask them is, tell me what's important to you as you consider your next opportunity. Prioritize for us how important the location you live is, how important is the practice style, how important is your financial remuneration, how important is the quality of life that the opportunity provides. So what we're really looking for is a better understanding of, not what they want necessarily, but what do they really need based on that feedback of how they prioritize those four distinct variables. In each of the opportunities that many recruitment firms, ours included, we don't represent an opportunity that we have not physically been to, visited, met the decision makers, met the other physicians, toured the community. So hopefully we're going to be able to help condense their search process by being able to share information that otherwise they wouldn't be able to have access to beyond just what they see on the internet.
If a physician, works with your firm in order to procure a job, do you then, what's the process in terms of, once they start looking and then even after they sign, is there a follow-up, things like that?
Yeah, the process is, they are not locked into anybody. Most physicians will typically use all the resources you mentioned. They're going to use their own contacts. They're going to look at the job boards. They're going to talk to recruiting firms to really make sure they are uncovering all of the opportunities that might be of interest to them. If they work with a recruitment firm, there's no obligation to them. Hopefully, the obligation we ask is just transparency and honesty about the process and what's important and where they stand. But there's no financial obligation to them. That will always be borne and owned by the hospital or group or academic institution that is recruiting. They are responsible for that fee. So there's no cost, if you will, to a physician. As far as follow-up, if they take a job which we represent and assisted them, then we typically within every 3 months, 6 months, we're trying to check in, see how the adjustment is going, anything we can do to help. But by and large, we're really trying to shift that relationship to the employer or to the candidate.
And so from the other side, you mentioned the hospital. Why would a hospital use a recruiting firm or a practice?
Supply and demand. I mean, depending on the specialty, the supply and demand equation is literally upside down. So, and again, depending on the specialty, the cost to a hospital of not having a specific physician can be, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars if those referrals are leaving the community. So they have a vested financial interest in being able to compress the time frame of recruiting a physician that fits their profile, that wants to be in their community, and using a recruitment firm. And to be fair, we work in towns that are critical access hospitals in which they've limited resource and very difficult to find qualified physicians. And we also work in major medical centers and major urban centers like Austin, Texas, that their challenges of finding somebody are different. That finding candidate CVs is easy for them, but finding candidates that want to be here for the right reasons is typically a bit more challenging. So we help, depending on the client's needs and what their focus is, we help navigate through all of those variables and hopefully being able to compress the time frame and find the right candidate for them in the most expeditious time frame possible.
Now, if I'm a physician who is looking to use a recruiting firm, what are some of the things that I should look for in order to discern between the firms that are out there?
Good question. So there are two types of recruitment firms by and large in the physician recruiting industry. There is contingency, which contingency firms are only paid if you take a job that they represent. In most cases, the contingency firm does not physically go to the community. They are representing typically a much higher volume of searches, and they add a lot of value if you are very, very geographically specific. So if you say, for family reasons, I've got to be in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'm not going to consider anything else, then they're a great resource because they're going to get your CV in front of every hospital, group, clinic that is in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. As an example, a retained firm like ours, we receive part of our compensation on the front end and then balance of that compensation once we have successfully recruited the physician. So groups and clinics that utilize our services, they are probably very serious because they are making a financial investment to initiate that process. And again, the other benefit is we've been to those communities. We truly better understand what the pros and what the cons are. And there is no nirvana. Right. So we're able to better articulate what the strengths and weaknesses of any given opportunity are.
Now, you did mention the cost is borne by the hospital or the practice. Can you discuss just generally what that would be?
Well, I don't know that it really adds value to those considering. I think there's such variance, I think, between firms and between the searches. So, for instance, what we as a company would charge for somebody who says, hey, we need a family practice to work in an outpatient clinic. We have a standard agreement for those types of searches. If somebody comes to us and says, hey, we need a senior VP of hospitalist medicine, to oversee a 50-doctor hospitalist practice who's really more of a leader than a clinician, that's a very different contract because the search, you're searching for a leader, not just a physician. So we have a variance of whether it's a clinician or whether it's a leader, and then there's kind of tiered system within that spectrum.
Okay. Now, what are some of the trends that you're seeing right now in terms of private practice employment versus hospital employment?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest trend over the last 3 or 4 years that we've seen, which is a shift to employment, whether it be employed by a group, whether it be employed by a hospital, corporation. Urgent care centers are popping up everywhere. I think last year in 2016, 92% of the searches in which we completed were employed physicians. I don't have the stats handy, but my bet is 10 years ago, that number might have been 20%, 25% maybe.
Wow.
So we've seen a huge shift to an employed model. Part of it is just the economics, and part of it is the physicians that are coming out of training are much more quality of life centric, generally speaking, than what their predecessors might have been.
Okay. And in terms of what kind of fields are in demand right now, and what's maybe a little bit out of favor?
Primary care. That has been constant and steady for a number of years. What I call a unicorn search now is a general internal medicine physician that will see outpatient and inpatient at the same time, in the same practice. That used to be very, very common, but that has, with the growth of the hospitalist movement over the last 20 years, that's become more and more rare. So primary care is still a huge driver for obvious reasons. We've also seen a significant shift in the last 3 to 4 years for psychiatry searches. Those have become, I think in our annual survey, I think that they've been in the top 5 specialties the last 3 years, and prior to that, I don't think they were in the top 10. So, and I can't necessarily articulate clearly why, but it is without question one of the most prevalent searches today that we're asked to do.
Okay. And any trends in terms of geographic areas? What areas are hot in that sense?
Well, I don't know that they're hot. They're still, based on our last survey, I think this was interesting. Historically, the Northeast has been the preferred region. I think this last survey, the Northeast slipped to number 2, and I think the Southeast actually edged them out for number 1, if I'm not mistaken. So those do ebb and flow. A fair amount of that does kind of depend on the political climate of what states are going through, what kind of reimbursement issues they might be having. There's always going to be just the flat out, hey, I want to live in nice weather, I'm going to move to California or Florida, or pick a geographically desirable state. That's just always going to be the case. But I think the financial strength, the financial structure based on healthcare, I think that has a little bit more of an impact than what it used to be.
And how about salaries and benefits? What are some of the trends you're seeing there?
We still see, in spite of what you read in here, there are still pockets of growth and increase in compensation. The MGMA does an annual compensation survey that is probably the most robust out there, and those trends are pretty meaningful. There are more specialties, I think, this past survey that were flat to slight growth than what there might have been in years past. But those in-demand specialties, we're still continuing to see growth and increase in their annual compensation.
What advice do you have for medical students or residents who may not be quite ready for the job search, but will be within the next few years?
Well, I think for medical students that are making the choice of, well, what do I want to do? You can take the financial component and factor that into the equation, and I think that's probably relevant. But at the end of the day, you know better than I that whatever specialty you choose, you better enjoy it because that's your life. That's your career. So it needs to be something that is more than just money. It needs to be something that you have a passion for, that the patient base that you're going to see, you have a passion for. Because you can't predict the future on compensation, but you can, relatively speaking, predict the future of the patients that you will see throughout your career. So I think that's should remain the primary driver. I think as residents are considering looking at opportunities, I think it's first and foremost, it's critically important that they really ask themselves what's important to me. Asking those questions to say, how important is money? How much medical school debt do I have? The average person who graduated, finished residency last year has $183,000 in loans. 37% have over $200,000 in loans. So if you fall into that category, it's okay to say, hey, I'm in debt. I need a job for the first 4 or 5 years that's going to allow me to put a huge dent in this debt. That's okay. There's no shame in saying, the money aspect is important. If the location is your primary driver and you're willing to make sacrifices to live in Austin, Texas, as an example, then great. But just be aware that you will unlikely to have your cake and eat it too, if you will. Right. So I think being clear on those priorities. And then equally important is if you are married or have a partner, that your spouse or partner be equally involved in the process and what is important to them from a personal standpoint, because that's probably where we see the greatest challenge or disconnect is working with physicians who their partner or spouse are not on the same page with what they want to accomplish. And that makes for some really difficult searches, as you might imagine. Right. So the more they can have those discussions before they begin to interview, I think the more enjoyable the process is for them because they're more clear on what's really important to them. And I think in doing so, it opens up opportunities. We place physicians every day to locations that they're not from that state. They really had probably never considered that state, but for whatever reason, it had variables that were intriguing to them that they took the time to further investigate, to interview, and then next thing you know, they're like, oh my gosh, this is where I'm going to call home. I would have never guessed. So I think the more clear they are, the more it opens up options for them.
Right. Now, how far in advance would you say someone who finishing residency or in fellowship, what point of their job search, a year in advance, 6 months in advance, when should they contact your firm or just in general, contact practices, things like that? What time span would you recommend?
Well, that's a good question. We see all sorts of variables there. We have already worked with physicians and have them they've signed contracts that are 2018 graduating residents. So some have already way ahead of the curve. They know what they want and they want to have it locked down for a variety of reasons. Those that do that usually do so for a couple of reasons. One, it allows them to focus in their last year of training to specifically gain the skills that they feel like are going to be most valuable in their new practice. Mm-hmm. So they can usually have some degree of adjustment in their last year of training to really just get greater depth on whatever that skill is. Alternatively, they also are signing early because stipends are becoming more and more prevalent. So if I'm a 2018 resident and I sign a contract tomorrow, there are some employers in which will offer, as part of your negotiation with them, a stipend of $1,000, $2,000, whatever the case may be, per month while you are training, in return for you committing to their organization, over a year in advance. So for those that are really struggling or not wanting to have to do as much moonlighting, that's a real valuable asset, if you will. And then you'll have some that, you know what, they're going to, just the way they're wired, they know there's a huge demand for them. They'll wait till 6 months before they graduate, and they'll test the waters and see what's out there. So that's also appropriate. It really depends on, the type A overachievers want to know what's going on, make decisions. They're going to be doing it earlier, and those that a little bit more laid back may wait till a little bit later in the process. Okay. There are pros and cons to both, so it really ends up being more about their own personality.
Now, are you what trends are you seeing for other health professionals, allied health professionals, PAs, nurse practitioners? I'm not sure if you guys recruit those fields as well, but if you do, what kind of?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, no surprise, since many PAs and nurse practitioners are primary care oriented. Continued demand for those, it continues to increase. Mm-hmm. Their compensation continues to increase. Those individuals are making what, 15 years ago, what a family physician was making. In many cases, that's what PAs and nurse practitioners can make now. So a huge demand. And then the other thing that we're seeing is beginning to see more specialization. So it may be orthopedic PAs or, cardiology PAs that are specific to a given specialty. Mm-hmm. As other specialties beyond primary care are looking for ways to be able to see more patients without having to add additional physicians, if you will. So there continues to be creativity and kind of thinking out of the box to figure out how to serve the needs of the population. When if you're only one cardiologist, you can only physically see so many patients. If you have a PA, it just expands that reach. So more and more groups those are very aggressively recruited specialties as well.
Now, you mentioned earlier about the high loan burden facing most of the recent graduates. Are you seeing any loan repayment programs from some of the hospitals you work with?
Absolutely. That is more common than stipends. Mm-hmm. Stipends they're done on occasion. They're becoming more prevalent, but I would offer that I think the number is 40% of recent grads received some form of assistance with their medical school debt, whether it be through government programs, mm-hmm. or whether it be through their employers that were offering assistance. That becomes more and more common. And as that number continues to climb, that variable becomes much, much more important to candidates. We have, 20 years ago, it was rare that somebody would lead with, hey, I've got a lot of debt that's important to me. I don't want that hanging over my head. I really want an opportunity to, that will assist me with that. Where it is not uncommon that is one of the first things we will hear from a physician, because they don't want that hanging over their head for years and years, and they're willing to be more open to the location or the practice style in return for assistance with their debt.
Now, this is a financial podcast, so what are some of the financial advice that you can give our listeners, our job seekers, and so maybe some of the mistakes that you've seen over the years that physicians have made?
Well, I'm a finance major at heart. That's where my degree was in. So I have pretty strong opinions on that, but I would simplify it to say that I did a presentation recently for a 100 and something fourth year medical students. Mm-hmm. And I asked the question for them to prioritize what's going to be important to you, et cetera. And only 2 people raised their hand when they said when money was the variable. So is money one of the most important variable to you? But yet, when I asked the question of how many of you have over $100,000 in debt, half the room raised their hand. And I still think there is a stigma for some physicians who, again, view medicine as a calling, that there's a stigma with being honest to say, hey, I also want to make money. I want to take care of my family. I want to have a retirement funded. I want to have my kids' education funded. It's okay to raise your hand and say, money is important to me, and I'm willing to work hard to make whatever is fair and reasonable, but there's no reason to say that that's not important if it is important. And I think that's the biggest thing I see is people not wanting to acknowledge out of fear of being judged or who knows what, but not being honest with those to say, hey, I'll go wherever, if it's really important, I'll move to wherever. I'm going to work for 5 years, because there's no more of the scarlet letter that goes with a physician that doesn't stay somewhere for 20 years. The mobileness of physicians is at an all-time high, and those are not viewed within reason. Of course, those that move every year, of course, you're going to have questions. But somebody that goes somewhere for 4 or 5 years for a specific reason, that's okay. So don't be shy about your financial needs. If that is a driver, own it and factor the equation. Factor that into your equation as you consider opportunities. Get your spouse or partner on board with you if that's indeed important to them, and factor that into your decision as you evaluate opportunities.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think there still is that stigma. I mean, obviously, there are other ways to get wealthy instead of going into medicine, and that shouldn't be your primary motivation. But it is an important consideration, especially given the degree of delay in earning power and the amount of cost it takes to become a physician. So, yeah, I think that's really an underrated piece of advice that you gave. It's real. It's an important issue. Don't acknowledge it, but learn about it, and then you can address it. So I want to thank you, Bob, for coming on the show today. Where can we find out more about you and the Medicus Firm?
Just go to www.themedicusfirm.com. Our website has all of my biographical information on our company. I think it has a lot of additional resources for physicians as well. So it's not just a website that will be beneficial to them as they evaluate opportunities, but it also is an opportunity to just gain information and knowledge about the industry and about some of the things they may be running into as well. So it was a pleasure, and happy to help any way I can.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Collins of the Medicus Firm for appearing on the show and talking about physician recruiters. Remember, it's probably not too early to begin your job search if you're a resident or a fellow. But even if you're a working or employed physician, it's never a bad idea to kind of keep your options open, because the changing environment in healthcare today, most people don't keep their same jobs for a lifetime the way previous generation of physicians did. So it's always good to just kind of keep your eyes open and keep abreast of what's happening in the job market. Thanks again for subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends. Again, our numbers keep growing, so I really want to thank you for listening. And again, send your comments to comments@drmoneymatters.com, all spelled out. And if you could, please leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, Google Play or Stitcher, or wherever you listen. See you next time.